Everyone. My name is Michelle Miller, Senior Planner here and Project Manager with Washington County Land Use and Transportation. Welcome back to our Technical Advisory Committee meeting members. We're here for the Limited Goal 5 program update, a focused look at fish and wildlife habitat. We've got a heavy agenda today, so we'll just kind of try to keep things short with the introductions today and a little bit about our agenda. We're going to be going over the draft inventory report that you received in your packet, as well as talk a little bit about the ESEE analysis. There'll be time at the end for public comment, and we'll get back with a wrap up. Let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded, and there'll be time for those in the audience that would like to address the TAC with some public comments at the end to let us know your thoughts. And go to the next slide. And here's the consultant team, as well as the staff, Washington County staff working on the project. Next slide, please. And for those TAC members that weren't able to make the last meeting, if you could do a quick introduction, that'd be great. Maybe starting with, is Tim here? I didn't see him pop on yet.
Yep, I am here.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes, there you are. Great. Hi, Tim.
Hi there.
Do you want to give?
Yep, got it. Yeah, I can start. So I'm Tim Moss with the Oregon Department of Forestry. I'm a Forest Practices Act field coordinator over there, and happy to be here and see what's going on.
Welcome. I believe Glenn.
Hi, everybody. Glenn Hamburg, planner with Metro. I took over from Tim O'Brien when he finally was allowed to retire in February/March. So I apologize for missing the last meeting with a schedule conflict, but I've had a chance to get up to speed with the project and to talk to some of you about the project already. So good to see the rest of you.
Thanks. And we have a sub for the Tualatin Hills Park and Rec. Did we get you on the? All right, we'll come back. We'll circle back, and I think Lacey, you weren't able to make it last time.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Lacey Townsend, the Executive Director of the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. Good to see all of you.
Thanks. And I believe Ted wasn't able to make it today, but thanks to everybody else for coming. Let's go to the next slide. All right, here's where we are with our schedule and our technical advisory kind of meeting schedule. We're at meeting number 2. We're looking over the inventory. These next couple of meetings are a little bit, we're not quite sure exactly the dates yet, but we'll be following up after this meeting with when the next technical advisory meeting is, working on the ESEE and the draft code concepts later this fall, with plans to have code amendments ready in the early next year to be ready to file by, we have that date in April for our filing of the code amendments. Next slide, please. So, one other thing, in your packet are the meeting notes. Did anyone have any comments on those from the last meeting that we should be aware of? I guess I had a question for you all. Okay, well, with that, I will turn it over to Ethan Rosenthal, who's been busy working on the draft inventory for our presentation today. And he's with DEA, David Evans and Associates. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks for everyone for being here. Appreciate everyone's attendance and input and feedback. So here's a kind of a quick agenda for going over the inventory update. I thought first we would do a quick recap of the inventory approach. This is expedited review overview of what we talked about last TAC meeting, so don't want to completely rehash it. And then give you a status update on where things stand as of today. And then we can do a little bit more of a dive in to thought we'd review how we approach looking at our small isolated upland habitat patches that we reviewed. These were the areas less than 2 acres. And we'll go into a little bit of detail on that. And then also give you run through some examples of some of the manual edits we made. And then look for your feedback. The stuff that we're going through today, it's described in more detail in the report that was included as part of the meeting materials that Michelle sent out previously, but this is an overview of that. So next slide. Yeah. So again, just kind of recapping our overall approach and what we're trying to achieve here. We've got the county's current inventory, which has their natural resources grouped into these 3 categories: water areas and wetlands, water areas, wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat, and wildlife habitat. And then we have Metro's inventory, Title 13 inventory, which breaks habitats down into riparian classes and upland habitat classes. And riparian is 1 through 3, and upland is class A, B, and C. But for this effort, we dropped the class 3 riparian and the class C upland habitat, and it kind of follows the Tualatin agreement from the past. And so the idea is there's these 2 different inventories that cover the same geography. They each have different kind of habitat classification nomenclature. And so we're trying to condense it down into one single consolidated inventory and update it to today's current reality. The county's work was done, I think, back in the 80s, and Metro's was early 2000, and a lot has changed since then. So next slide. This is just an example of how these 2 inventories look similar yet different. So you can see the county's mapping. You can see the thin blue lines. That's the water-related habitats, pretty narrow corridor along the streams. If you compare that to Metro's, Metro's is a little bit more what folks might be familiar with, Clean Water Services regulations, where they add a buffer for the riparian areas based on steep slopes. And this is near the Cooper Mountain area, where these kind of steeper sloped areas. So that's why you see much more blue and less green. Also in Metro's mapping, the upland habitat, the green shading, you can see that a good chunk of the development has been sort of recognized, although there's been some development since that mapping that Metro's showing. And you can, so it's just a quick overview of we're trying to figure out how to blend these 2 things in and make them make sense. And basically we're running forward in terms of habitat naming. We decided to go with the Metro habitat naming conventions. Next slide. All right. Yeah, and so basically, the steps we're going through, one was to define the map refinement area. We have the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by map refinement area. And then we're consolidating the county and Metro mapping, like I just talked about, bringing those 2 different inventories together. The next step is since this is all fairly old data, we're removing developed areas as best we can. And then we're testing for significance, and the significance test is largely trying to reproduce as much as possible kind of Metro's significance testing, from that analysis way back when. And then the last step will be to incorporate city community plan data. So there are certain areas where it says city, it should probably say city and county community plan data. Basically work that's recently been done. We'll already have more recent mapping, and we're going to be pulling that into this update as is based on those different community plan updates. Next slide. And so this map is showing it's kind of a lot going on here. I have to look, take a step back to kind of see it all. But the overall study area is the county's unincorporated urban area. But you can see the orange areas on there. Those are the new community plan areas that I was just talking about. So there's like North Bethany, East Bonnie Slope, and then like Cooper Mountain area, and some of the Hillsborough, Witch Hazel, Village South, and a few other areas on there that have all been recently in the past few years updated, had their own very detailed review. So in those orange areas, we're just pulling the information in as is based on those updates. What we're referring to as the map refinement area, that's everything in blue. That's where we're applying this current method of taking county and metro mapping, bringing it together, removing developed areas, and looking at these small patch areas. And basically the additional stuff we'll be kind of running through in a moment here. Next slide. All right, so now just a kind of a status update on where we are with the draft inventory report. So that was provided in the packet that was given out. Some of the things that we achieved, and I'm going to apologize in advance. Slides were pulled together just before I headed on vacation. And so I probably could have done a little bit better job with some of the fonts and stuff. So apologies for the readability here. So anyway, status update, we incorporated oak patch data from Intertwine and also habitat connectivity data from Intertwine. We got that via Metro. And those were 2 layers in addition to the ODFW habitat connectivity layer. Those were all data sets that from the last TAC meeting folks mentioned and suggested we take a look at and see if we can incorporate that into our analysis. And we brought that in to look at the small isolated upland habitat patches, those areas less than 2 acres. And I'll go into that a little bit more in some additional slides. For the map refinement area, we're about 95% complete. We ended up doing considerably more manual editing than anticipated. Our initial thought and hope was that we could do very much a GIS overlay exercise, but what we discovered was with the RLIS data of like developed lands, sometimes it was coded in ways that would have made it very easy to remove developed areas, but in other areas we couldn't make heads or tails of it. And so it wasn't going to be a simple cookie cutter exercise of one layer over another. So I ended up doing quite a bit of manual editing. There's still a little bit more that remains. Some of that might depend on some feedback we get from this meeting. Yeah. And then the other thing is what we, in the version of the report that was provided to you, we only included maps and tables for the map revision area, but we're going to be adding in tables of habitat change and results for those community plan areas as well in the final version. So we still need to do that. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to kind of focus in on the small, I should say, isolated upland habitat patches. Basically, Metro's previous like significance tests basically looked at upland habitat if it was connected directly to a riparian corridor, it was kind of kept in the inventory, or if it was an isolated patch but it was 2 acres or greater, it was kept. But they for those smaller patches, they looked at I'm trying to remember the term. Habitats of concern is the term that they used, and that was kind of looking more at if there was known important unique habitat types. If ODFW had specified, hey, this is a critical little piece of habitat, then they kind of kept those bits, and so we wanted to do something similar here, and so. And looking at these smaller isolated habitats, again, for uplands, we looked at parks and open spaces. If it was in a park and open space, we generally kept it. If it was in a protected tract from a development and there was a set aside, we kept it, and that usually showed up as a homeowner association tract in the RList database. Then we also looked at the ODFW habitat connectivity model, the intertwined connectivity model, and then the oak patch mapping. And then there were a few exceptions as we manually, after we did this run through with, kind of overlaying with GIS layers as part of the manual review, I gave a little closer inspection to things and sometimes decided even if it the GIS layers showed it should be kept. Maybe I saw something in the aerial photo that made me think, no, we can remove that here. So next slide. All right, so a lot going on here, but this is showing you the ODFW connectivity layer. And this is from a statewide model that ODFW pulled together for habitat connectivity. So it's a very coarse level of detail when you start zooming in. They gave us a subset, they clipped to the Washington County. The black lines you see on the map there, that's our actual map revision area that we're looking at. Each hexagon from their model is about 40 acres, so it's a big area, and those hexagons can encompass anything from forested area to a parking lot. But there's something in there that triggered that hexagon to be mapped. So the way we use this for our small patch test, we basically said if our small patch of habitat coming out of the metro and county habitat mapping overlays, if any of that overlapped with an ODFW hexagon, then we retain that. However, it could be removed if, based on best professional judgment during the manual review, basically I determined that it was just captured because it's a very coarse model and it doesn't really seem to align with some kind of clear corridor connectivity that was presenting itself in aerial photography or even some of the other layers that we'll go into from the intertwine. Yeah. So next slide. So this is the small patch test or intertwined habitat connectivity layer. And I realize it's hard to get a full picture, like you kind of have to zoom in. But basically what you're seeing here is, well, one, for Metro, this was a regional area model. And I should say it's a metro area regional model. It's highly detailed with multiple results layers that were provided to us. It covered aquatic, terrestrial, and oak-specific wildlife habitat species as surrogates for assessing connectivity of habitats. For our work, I also want to add that this is still, my understanding is that the modeling is completed, but as far as guidance on how to use the results, that's still a work in progress. So with, this and also the oak patch layer that we'll show next, that's also the case where there's scoring, but there's no guidance on how to make use of that scoring. So we had to make some quick assumptions in terms of how we're going to use this, and I'll explain a little bit of that here now. So one of the layers that was provided is this all habitat sum connectivity results. And that's the layer that we chose to use because it, there's a layer that's specific to aquatic, there's one specific to terrestrial, one specific to oak, but there's also this sum. And so we figured the sum captures everything. And then the pixels in the model, I can't recall the resolution, but they're fairly small. Where the ODFW is like 40 acres. These are like, I think 10 feet by 10 feet or something, so a much smaller, finer resolution. So basically we looked at the different, when you're looking at the map, you can see that there's a high rating, a moderate rating, and a low rating. And you can see that that blue covers a much broader area where there's a lot less of the orange and red, the moderate to high rating for connectivity. We focused in on the moderate and higher for our screening. So basically, if our isolated habitat patch intersected, overlapped with one of these moderate or high connectivity pixels, we retained our habitat mapping. Again, I could look at it when doing our manual review, and if it looked like maybe it was just like a little bit of noise in the model, because sometimes you'd see a whole sea of blue and then just one little blip of orange, and when you look at the aerial photo, it wasn't apparent to me, how that came to be. If it was something like that, I may have decided that wasn't enough to keep that little small patch of habitat and to retain it. Next slide. And so the next one is the oak patch screening. And so again, talking about small isolated upland habitat patches. Here you can see the dark green areas. Those are the areas of oak within our study area, also kind of outside of our study area as well. And again, there wasn't guidance on how to use this data. This is the oak patch data, and each patch was provided a score. I don't recall offhand. In the report I mentioned this, but I don't recall what the range of the scores were in our study area, but the average score was 221. So our approach was to take the average quality oak patch or better and retain that. That was our test. So if our habitat patch overlapped with an oak patch that was average or better, we retained it. And again, through manual review, if I saw that, because I think that the original oak data, I believe, is from 2018. So if I saw in aerial photos that there are simply no trees left in that area, then we wouldn't retain that habitat polygon based on this testing. Okay, next slide. So that's it for the small patch, isolated habitat patch kind of approach to how we decided to keep it or remove it. As far as manual edits go, our approach there was so in the maps that were provided to you, I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to look at those maps, but I can't remember how many sheets that was. Maybe it was like 20 to 30 sheets. But we looked at things on a much smaller scale, and we created 1 inch equals 200 foot scale PDF maps. So it was roughly, oh, not roughly, it was 481 PDF maps, 11 by 17 maps. And basically I just looked at all those, marked them up, and then provided that to our GIS analyst to make those edits via our red lines. The county also reviewed those markups as part of the process. Next slide. And so here are just some examples. I'll run through some examples of our manual edits just to kind of give you a feel for it. These here you see in the upper left corner says example 2. This is directly out of the report that we provided you, has these same examples. So this is just number 2 of the examples that were provided. So you can see, I can't really, up by in the upper left, where it says example 2, right next to that, you'll see it says delete areas substantially developed, managed backyards, abutting protected corridor. So it's just to help give you a picture of, even though through our combining of the metro and county layers, this area showed up as being habitat. It was clearly developed, and it's a housing and a backyard. And then if you look kind of that long narrow strip of red polygon, this is an area where again it's substantially developed. They're managed backyards, and it's abutting. You can see where that green stipple pattern, it means it's a protected area, either park or open space. But the area on the actual single family residences, it's just these thin slivers overlapping. And we didn't really want to burden a homeowner with, going through the whole process just for that really slim amount of maybe vegetation overhang onto their property. We can go to the next slide. A lot of these are fairly similar. So here's this situation where we had a mapped creek and riparian corridor, but based on a combination of aerial photo review and also Clean Water Services stream mapping. CWS, they map, in their mapping, they code for open stream channels versus piped. And so in terms of using that review, we pulled out some of the riparian habitat mapping that showed up in like this. This is coming from Metro's Title 13 riparian mapping. And we left a little bit of stream where we could see on the aerial photo, there's an open channel. It's in a protected area, a little park. And so that'll remain the riparian area around that. Next slide. Again, here you can see on the right side of the screen, it's a big shopping area. So we just went in and cleaned that up because it's obviously not riparian area, it's a paved area. So we'll remove that. And then on the left side in pink, this we saw in a few places, and I may even need to just double check in a few additional places that we didn't miss anything like this. But so something I didn't go, we talked about in our previous TAC meeting, I didn't review once again here, but we did do an initial screen along riparian areas for lots that were, I believe it was 10,000 square feet, that we just automatically pulled the habitat out of that. But what we discovered in a few key places is that, in this situation, when you zoom into the aerial photo, I could see that there's still an open channel there. It is a fairly ditched channel, but it is still is part of a natural stream. And looking at ODFW fish distribution maps, I could see that there was native fish mapped in that stream by ODFW. And so we wanted to make sure that we had clearly even though it might be a very slim riparian corridor remaining, we still wanted to make sure that was in there in case anything comes in for development review, that it'll be clear we want to maintain that open channel habitat through there. But then the big red polygon going north-south, that was a section of stream where I just simply did not see a channel when I was zooming in on the aerial photos, and ODFW didn't have it mapped as fish habitat, and it's all backyards. And so through there, felt comfortable removing the riparian habitat through there. So, next slide. Yeah, so here's an area where so one of the things we looked at, we received a layer from Clean Water Services, which was like a development layer or development review layer, where they had looked at, it kind of showed where they had reviewed, where development had gone through a development review through them. And in those areas, generally speaking, we didn't map habitat in those areas because you could clearly see where there was a tract that had been left protected, and then there was like single family residences, and it was just those backyard situations like we saw elsewhere. But then there were some areas like this where we had these few remaining bits of riparian habitat. They're outside the protected tract, that the green stippling, but it's still kind of in people's backyards. And there's in some areas it's very clearly there are trees there, but we don't really know what use is being going underneath, and so there's still some cleanup to do here, but also sort of, I guess I'll say, if the TAC has input on we're not so concerned about this if you remove that. Clearly there's a protected corridor with the along with that green stippling, and there's been a set aside track. And kind of look for your input on that. And then there's one more slide, and then we'll go into questions, and you can kind of share your feedback. Next slide. And so this is another area. So the previous one was kind of focused on riparian. This one's a little more focused on upland habitat. We have since cleaned this up. The yellow is the upland habitat. We have since cleaned this up a little bit, removed some of the very obvious development, like in that upper left corner where there's a big building and parking area. But we're still kind of left with this, these forest sort of patches and long kind of meandering, squiggling things through neighborhoods. There is technically, well, when you look at the GIS layers, it's connected to the riparian corridor, but very tenuously. And looking through like the oak and the connectivity layers, none of them occur in this area. So we're sort of left with this kind of meandering, neighborhood trees with a few larger patches. And so we're still going to be cleaning this up, and we'll still be testing it for, if after cleanup, the areas are less than 2 acres. But again, it's just a sort of an area to put out there to the TAC to see if you have any thoughts on this. If you're like, oh my God, no, you can't get rid of these areas, or yeah, no, we understand. We can't manage every little, thin strip of trees and whatnot. Next slide. Yeah, so that's it for the natural resource update. I covered a lot of ground, and but kind of put it to you guys, to the TAC, and to see if there are any questions, if you need clarification, or if you have input you want to provide. Good, bad, terrible, wonderful, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, it looks like oh, sorry. Good. Ready to start? Okay. Ready to start with questions? Great. It looks like Fran had her hand up first, and then Matt did.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. I'm sorry. So my name is Fran Warren, and I've been volunteering full-time in Washington County for over 20 years. Mostly first started with transportation, but I've been doing significant natural resource and ground truthing kinds of stuff. I was also on the Oak and Prairie intertwine, as well as on the regional corridors and connectivity teams. So I'm kind of close to this stuff. And but I'm a volunteer and not a technical, although I'm a techie person. I just want to mention two things. I see Ted Labby is missing, and I know that Urban Green Spaces is currently in a hiatus at the moment. I really value that kind of input because we kind of work very well together, having a scientist expert and what I do. So just mark that as a concern. And the other one is, at some point in time, I'm sure, Ethan, you're going to give us some idea later about how much ground truthing you've been able to do versus the high level 30,000 foot scans, et cetera. And the third part is, I won't go into all the details because I had a whole bunch of questions about the various maps, but there are cases where the community scientists might be able to assist in some of those areas of mystery in terms of how do we detect them. I know I took Ryan Martin through a walk through Cooper Mountain. There were a lot of areas were not on any of the maps. And once he saw what they look like now, 25 years after the original mapping, he made, we got a new zoning thing called SNR, which is new area of significant natural resource. So maybe some of that walking by locals to provide whatever documentation is required, et cetera. And the last point I have is we did a lot on barriers, corridors, and connectivity. Two areas that maybe you are not considering here, and that is movement of seeds that have to need either water or other methods to go from one area to another. And the other major one that I've been pushing for is protection of headwaters. Top of Cooper Mountain has headwaters that filter all the way down to creeks, et cetera. And there is nothing identifying areas of headwaters. So that's my long story, but I love that we're diving into this in depth, and anything I can do to be of assistance, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. That sounds great. Ted did reach out to us just before the meeting, said he couldn't make it, but he'll be reading the notes. He also wanted to make sure that we had the oak and intertwined habitat connectivity data, so I kind of assured him that we had it and have been integrating it. At this point, we have not done on the ground truthing. There is very limited budget for that, and I'm sure after this TAC meeting, we'll be getting together the county and consultants to kind of figure out how much of that is needed or not needed, or what the expectation at this level we're going to go to. And then I think one other thing, I didn't mention this in the approach recap, but it is an important detail that this inventory process has been one of taking existing data as our starting point, combining it, and then subtracting areas that have been developed, as opposed to if there are new areas that were never mapped as habitat, pulling those areas in. That's the assignment that was given to me, and I know Michelle and others can probably speak more to that kind of starting point. But anyway, maybe we move on to Matt.
Yeah.
Ethan, can you restate what that last piece that you said? And I'm not going to try to say it myself, but can you repeat what you just last said?
I can try.
Okay.
So yeah, our starting point for this whole analysis was the county's Goal 5 mapping, Metro's Title 13 mapping, combining them, and then removing areas of development,
Okay.
but not expanding. So if there's some area that was never mapped by the county or Metro, I'm not going in and creating some new polygon that was never on a map before.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would only add that the new community plan areas, those orange areas you saw before, we're taking the city's data in that case.
Yeah, good point.
And those
Yeah.
inventories, not just that clarification, but that's the task that the board directed us to do with this exercise, is using our those existing inventories that we've already reviewed.
Okay. But by creating the upland by putting Metro's upland layers on our community plan maps, we are adding polygons, correct?
In that sense, yes. It's compared to, so before in these areas, if you just had to deal with Washington counties, Goal 5 mapping, this was my experience when working on individual projects that had to go through the review, is that the code would say, okay, you need to address the county's Goal 5 mapping, but you also need to consider Metro's mapping. We would do that, and then, but as we went through the process, the county reviewer would eventually say, okay, thank you for looking at Metro's upland stuff, but we can't actually do anything there. So I'm curious for Teresa, it sounded like you're.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so this is the inventory stage, and the kind of significant stage. So those, we're saying in this that these resources exist, and they still exist. But the next two stages are assessing the kind of balancing the economic, social, environmental, and equity consequences of allowing or not allowing development to happen in these areas. And then after that, from that, we'll look at regulations. So we're not saying that this is the regulatory map. And we've talked before about that this is the inventory. We may have, through that process, a different map that becomes our inventory map that gets into our community plans based on what that further analysis is. So, so just saying, this isn't necessarily the map that's going into the community plan, and that it doesn't necessarily mean a specific type of regulation of these areas. It's just the inventory.
Okay, I recognize it's hard to separate the two, because when you don't know what the regulations are going to be, it creates some, I guess, presumptions when you see overlays on maps, which gets me to the first thing. I haven't even gotten to my questions yet. Gets me to the first thing, which is when we were going through and doing steep slope mapping and Goal 5 mapping in Bethany, there was a note placed upon those maps, basically with recognition that this is aerial extrapolation, it's not ground truth, and that the boundaries that are set forth on these maps are illustrative at best, and to be kind of further refined through the ground truthing process. And so my hope is that as we get closer to ending up with a map that is the final Goal 5 mapping, that it includes a similar note to that. And so then my first question is about the riparian. Are we going to no longer have water areas and wetlands fish and wildlife habitat on our maps, and we're going to now be referring to it to riparian class 1 and riparian class 2?
So
nod yes. Sorry.
Yes, and I think this is something we still need to kind of work through, because in the community plans that have already been done, especially those done by the county, they're still using the county's terminology. But in our map refinement area, we're generally speaking, we're using the Metro's terminology of riparian habitat and upland habitat. And there's still the question of like, in the end, are we going to call it riparian class 1 and 2 or just riparian? Is it going to be upland A and B or just upland, to simplify it more? So I think that's kind of where we're at. And the general idea also is that for riparian, and I might be, Teresa, cut me down here if I'm stepping over the bounds, that for riparian, if you have to do clean water services, site assessment work, that would cover you for riparian.
And that's my understanding. I'm going to ask that question 100 times during this process, probably, because that's my biggest concern is that we're going to create another layer of regulation when we already have clean water services standards that we need to be addressing when we go through this process. So the acreages on page 11 of your report, you had about 1,800 square acres. I'm sorry, 1,800 acres of water area and wetland fish and wildlife habitat, but you have about 3,168 acres of riparian class 1 and riparian class 2. Is that difference the vegetated corridors that are being added?
Can you repeat those?
So
numbers?
page 11 under table 4.
Yeah.
You have water area and wetlands 851 acres. And then water area and wetlands fish and wildlife habitat 951 acres. But then if you go to table 5 and you go to the 2 riparian classes, the total, it jumps up about 1,500 acres. So I'm trying to figure out why.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. That it's and actually, if we in the slides, I think Brandon was controlling the slides. If you go towards the beginning of my section, keep going. There you go, right there. Oop. The one with the 2 map. Go down one more. There you go. So, Matt, I think this is what you just described is that the map on the left is the county's mapping, and you can see that the blue it's a very, I'm guessing it's just 50 feet on each side of a stream.
Or more, or more with topo,
Yeah, it's not accounting on steep slopes. But if you look at the Metro version 1, it's much wider because you have those steep slopes up on the Cooper Mountain area. I don't know if it's still Cooper Mountain if you're on the north side of Cooper Mountain. Yeah.
So the acreage is the additional buff. The county's mapping is just the stream channel, basically.
Yeah.
And the riparian class 1 and 2 mapping, it includes
counts for the steep
of what
slopes.
the buffer would be.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. The last thing is that there was a lot of I did go through all the maps, and there's a lot going on. And what is easiest for me to look at is here's what's before and here's what's after. And instead of seeing here's what the county shows, here's what Metro shows, here's what the overlap is, and it just seemed really cumbersome for me. So if there's any way to produce a map that would be, here's what our riparian resources look like before these set of maps were provided, and here's what they look like after, and just kind of where it shows where the edges are different. I've seen maps like that before, and I know we're talking about a much larger area in this case, but if it's possible to do that, that's helpful for me to see.
Okay.
And then the last thing before I'll shut up is, can you scroll back? There was a map where you showed example 2. I think it was scrolling back, and maybe it was scrolling.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So I guess the hard part of this conversation is that if you see the street stub on Southwest, whatever it is, Valentour, there's a subdivision right in front of us, and then there's undeveloped property just to the west of us. And I know that someday that property owner expects that they're going to have an opportunity to develop their property. And I also anticipate that when that subdivision was built, it probably looked very similar to the property west there. Is that the decisions I guess we're making through this process could have a drastically different outcome for that property owner than what we ended up with to the east there. I mean, and I guess I'm hoping that we can respect that through this process, is that we can't have too great an impact to those underlying owners. I didn't say that very well, but I just thought this was a good example of where we could be doing something there that could be a major impact to those landowners.
Okay, there's a question from Glenn. Hands up. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, maybe less of a question, but just in response to sort of Ethan's questions right before we were going into the Q&A about how do we think about these areas of upland habitat that are kind of just these weird finger shapes? Do we include them? Do we not include them in the inventory? And I definitely don't want to say anything that might sound like advocacy for doing less in terms of habitat protection, but I thought I would just offer in response that it's my understanding that back in 2005, when Metro was coming up with Title 13, that one of the things it tried to think about in terms of what was of value to protect were things that were things that recognized edge effects of habitat. And so it didn't want to necessarily include things that GIS or other techniques would catch that were just long, skinny features that were disconnected from anything else, out of some sort of recognition that that's going to have probably less environmental benefit in terms of, shelter for animals and that sort of thing. So one of the factors that all of the methodology tried to use was not just size and connectivity, but also the shape of some of these features. Were they big and round, or were they long, skinny? If they were long and skinny and relatively small and disconnected, it's my understanding, at least, that wasn't something that was necessarily intended to be protected.
Thank you. That's helpful input.
Oh, it looks like there's another question from Ariana.
Ariana.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that the impact to migration corridors, a lot of migration corridors are really narrow, long connections between two parcels. And so with that in mind, removing, these narrow strips that may seem like they're not connecting anything important could be something as small as a northern red-legged frog migratory corridor between breeding habitat and upland foraging habitat. So I think that there's a lot of considerations and a lot of factors that we have to look at.
Thank you, Ariana.
Thank you.
And I think, Ethan, you did try and look at, this example isn't a particularly good one to show this, but where there was a connection, like it was upland was providing a particular connection to riparian area. This doesn't touch a riparian area, but it's a little bit more of a tenuous connection. I think that's why it's a more challenging example.
Yeah,
yeah, that
and
finding that balance is going to be challenge,
yeah,
part of the challenge,
totally.
I think.
Totally. And in this case, we do have that the intertwines habitat connectivity data to look at too, and that didn't overlap with any of all this yellow upland habitat. So that was helpful too,
Yeah. I see that Amanda has a question.
Yeah, thank you. So with the question about this yellow area, if it were retained as is, would it mean that the Metro Title 13 protections would apply, or would there be different county protections?
So I can jump in on that one, I think. So
Yep.
Ethan, well, maybe I can. Ethan, is this in, this is in the old UGB?
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, Title 13 does not specify any level of protection. So it was on the inventory, and then Metro in its own ESEE analysis concluded that areas that were upland A and B, unless they were in public ownership, like a park, and that was intended for not active recreation. So those areas were to be protected inside the, what I call the old UGB, which is the pre December 28th, 2005 UGB. And so the regulatory map that came out of the Metro process, so this was the inventory, and then the regulatory map was with the HCA maps. And those areas that were Class A and B upland habitat in those old UGB areas did not end up with a specific regulatory paradigm in Title 13.
Okay, so the answer to the question is that they would just be, I'm still going to use the word protected,
Okay.
under or addressed under Title 13, not any additional county layer.
Well, in this particular case, right, there's no overlapping county layer. Ethan was looking where there was county overlapping with Metro. I think, Ethan, do you want to talk about that circumstance again?
Well, actually, I think I'm okay with making my point then. So my understanding is that it's not that they don't have protections, but the protections are that the local government needs to have in their code kind of easy ways for avoidance of these areas when they're developing. So, and if that's true, then I don't know why it would still probably be a good idea to keep the layer, because if that avoidance is still useful when people are developing, and it's not even necessarily required, it just makes it easier for them to avoid, then so that's kind of where I was going with thinking that maybe the identified areas should remain identified.
I think your point is really a good one, and a great segue actually to the ESEE conversation, because that decision, so keeping things in the inventory, saying they've been determined to be significant, and keeping them in the inventory says that they will be part of the continuing conversation and that next step of Title 13 compliance and an ESEE if needed. And so that's the next part of this conversation, which is after you make that determination of significance, then for those resources, what is the next step? And so this determination of significance is kind of a first cut. Is it still a significant resource? And yes, leaving things on the table in order to have that conversation and make a decision about, okay, what does that, protection program look like? Is it development friendly practices and voluntary and, other things like that? Or is it, that comes out of the ESEE and that conversation about balancing. A really good point. Are there other questions about the inventory, or are we ready to move on to the next part of this? Okay. Well, Ariana, you have your hand up again. Or is that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I was curious, what's the definition of substantially developed? Ethan, you mentioned that a couple of times when you were looking at the map. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, you're muted, Ethan.
Paved gravel driveway, or a mowed backyard, yeah, those sorts of.
Were you looking at a percentage of the total land area? Because we were looking at backyards and some of them had, forested riparian buffers, and you were removing some of those sections. What percent of the property, is it a calculation of area?
It gets to a point where it's a person looking at it and making a personal judgment, trying to estimate, I see lawn, I see a few scattered small shrubs or trees that look like they're probably just ornamental. And then at some point it becomes a more natural looking forest connected to something else. So it's kind of that.
Okay.
At some point it's
'Cause
that level of detail. Yeah.
I was curious because the backyard habitat certification program, engages landowners in developing native habitat in the city. And so a property that has 5,000 square feet and then only has, 1,000 square foot yard, would that be less than, or would that be substantial? I'm just curious where the line is drawn.
That's I mean, I guess I'd have to look at it. If it's on its own, I think 5,000 square feet, a 5,000 square foot lot, was basically determined to not meet significance test from the get-go. So the smaller lots, and then it, is more a matter of, is on the aerial photo, does it look like it's connected to a larger patch of habitat? Or if it's, isolated, less than 2 acres, did it overlay with, ODFW's connectivity or intertwines connectivity layer or the oak patch layer? Then we would keep it. Yeah.
And
But I don't think the county, I don't think the county was wanting to put some sort of regulatory mechanism, protection mechanism on, your typical voluntary plantings in someone's backyard or something like that.
Yeah, I'm just curious, especially for larger lots, that when we start to, have this buffer that's buffering a buffer, and we remove the buffer, what type of protection are we gaining or losing? What kind of level of restriction for, future developers will there be? What type of, how will it look in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it kind of just start to go into the ESEE and then to the actual regulations that we're going to be coming up with to kind of direct that, because currently the county they don't have a tree code, so it's not really going to be protected like that. Like maybe in a city, those sort of margin habitats might be protected by a tree code or something. So, but yeah, I don't know, Teresa or Michelle, do you have any thoughts?
Again, I think let's keep moving on the just in the interest of time, and also because I think a lot of we are starting to drift into that conversation about, well, what does it mean? Like what is the result of being on the map? And that question is kind of goes into the next step. So with that, let's keep moving if that's okay. Unless there are any outstanding questions before I switch to the next topic. Okay, all right. Can I get the next slide there, Brandon? Great. So I have this rather cryptic little chart, and I'm going to step us through each of these squares just to try and help folks understand the flow, because complying with Goal 5 sometimes means just following Title 13, which is the Urban Growth Management Functional Plan Title 13, which is nature and neighborhoods, right? So I'm going to take a step through this, and then I'll do it rapidly, and then we can talk about what the standard Goal 5 process means for those resources that are subject to that.
And Kathy, just a really quick thing, because this doesn't specifically say it, but Title 13 is Metro's Urban Growth Management Functional
right, thank
Plan.
you.
So for people who don't,
Yeah, Metro's Urban Growth Management Functional Plan, Title 13. Yeah, and it's such a mouthful, I'm just going to call it Title 13. And hopefully everybody's going to track with that. So next slide. So square number 1 at the top was that, Goal 5, it's OAR 660023. And we've talked about this. We talked about this at the first meeting. But I think, and I'm not expecting anybody to read that applicability, but that is the applicability for a HOPA or a post-acknowledgement plan amendment. And so what we believe and understand is that the project that we're talking about right now will affect Goal 5 resources, and it is obviously happening after September 1st, 1996. And so therefore, we will be applying 660023. So next slide. So keeping on with that, so we all agree we're heading down that path, and then that splits. And I'm going to talk about the left side of that original chart first, which is for regional resources. So what the Goal 5 rule says, and again, I'm going to call it the Goal 5 rule just for ease of saying it. It is 660023 in this case. What it says about Metro regional resources is that if Metro has done an analysis and adopted a rule, that we follow that rule for those resources. So in this case, we're talking about riparian, and Metro had identified those as Class 1 and Class 2, and that is those riparian resources, that's a category, riparian corridors they're called in 660023. And also what we've been calling upland wildlife habitat, that's what Metro calls it. Class A and B in our particular case were determined to be significant. And again, that's wildlife habitat in the OAR. So those are the 2 Goal 5 resources that Metro said we are going to do our own. We've done a process. And so in the future, now that that's acknowledged, local governments that are subject to that in those areas follow that process. That's what so we're still complying with Goal 5, right? But by Goal 5 is pointing us to Title 13 in this case. So next slide. So Title 13, interestingly, kind of splits into 2 things. So we have obviously, there's a rule, it's very specific. There are options for jurisdictions to comply with Title 13. And so for some regional resources, the rule is that you're in substantial compliance with Title 13. Washington County does that by following the basin program. That's one of the options outlined in Title 13. So we're going to stick with that approach. And so that is, when we think about that, we're typically thinking about riparian habitat areas, because again, that's what, after Metro did their ESEE and reached a program decision, which is Title 13, that's what they were directing. And so that basin program, and that's really, we're thinking about that primarily for areas that are in, and I'm just going to call it the old UGB. And when I say that, I mean pre-December 28, 2005 UGB areas. And I know when I say new and it's 2005, that's not very new, but that's the dividing line between, because that's the year that the program took effect, Title 13. So other areas though, Title 13 does a fun thing in that it says, yeah, follow, Goal 5 tells us follow Title 13, then Title 13 says, yeah, but if you're going to do these other things, you got to go loop back up to Goal 5. And the jurisdiction needs to follow the standard Goal 5 process. So now we're still following Goal 5. Goal 5 says, look at Title 13. Title 13 says, oh, wait a minute, for certain situations, you go back to Goal 5, right? Okay. So the box on the right, it's like, okay, yeah, Title 13, but then Title 13, we go back up to a standard Goal 5 process. So in this case, we're thinking about that for situations where we would be adopting new regulations for Class A and B wildlife habitat, other than in the new UGB areas. And also if we are in the situation where we would be adopting new regulations that are stricter than Title 13. So if a jurisdiction wants to be more restrictive than is what is considered substantially compliant, then you would have to do an ESEE. So let's go to the next slide. All right, in summary, what does this all mean? So the green box, which is the intersection of, again, the old UGB with significant riparian areas, Class 1 and 2. We're proposing continued compliance with Title 13. That's the Tualatin Basin approach. And that this is related to your question, what's happening in those areas. That basin approach outlines kind of compliance with clean water services and also a lot of voluntary programs for those areas. And so it identifies a program for those areas. Great. If we are, and I'm going to go down the old UGB column. So there's orange areas. And so for orange areas, and this would be regionally significant upland habitat, that's A and B, and any locally significant resources. So if there were any county wildlife areas that are not otherwise protected, but end up being on the inventory and being considered significant, those areas, because those areas were not regulated, like Metro's Title 13 program and their ESEE said, we're only going to regulate these if they are publicly owned open space intended for habitat use and not active recreation. We are doing something different than that, being more potentially, again, potentially, this is the conversation, but we need to do an ESEE. We need to balance those factors if we're going to do something different. So Metro is saying you need to do an ESEE on those areas. We're agreeing, yes, we're going to do an ESEE for those areas. For areas that are in the new UGB, and again, new being post December 28th, 2005, we think for regionally significant riparian areas and for regionally significant upland wildlife habitat, including both Class A and B, Title 13 said, hey, those are significant resources. In these new areas, we expect protection for those areas more so than in the old UGB. At least, I mean, riparian comparable, but for upland habitat, you need to take a closer look at those. And so because of that, and because we want to have a conversation about what that level of protection is, we're recommending that we do an ESEE, a supplemental ESEE analysis. We think, our understanding is we cannot be less protective than substantial compliance with Title 13. But just to have a conversation about what that looks like, and does anybody, in balancing the ESEE factors, do we want to be more protective? Do we want to at least kind of have that community conversation about what that means? It seems like a supplemental ESEE analysis to revisit that and just kind of talk that through with the community is the right way to go. So we see that as I won't say voluntary, but we're going to use the ESEE as a tool to have a community conversation about those significant resources in those areas. It's a little bit different than maybe the conversation that we would be having about, say, riparian areas in the old UGB. And similarly, locally significant resources, so any kind of county designated, so it wasn't a metro regional resource, it's not covered by Title 13 at all, any of those, if there are any, would also need to go through a standard goal size process, kind of regardless of whether they're in the old UGB or the new UGB. So that, in kind of summary, is what we're proposing to do. And I'll talk about the ESEE process, what that looks like. So, oh boy. So do I foresee any problems? And I see hands popping up. I think it was Matt, Amanda, and then Fran.
Just a clarification. So the new UGB that would apply to areas that are going to end up in cities, and the cities would do that evaluation, correct?
No, if we're adopting regulations in that kind of interim period to protect those areas,
Okay.
then we need to go through the ESE process and do that balancing for those conflicting uses that are allowed by the holding zones, shall we say, so like by an FD 20 or something like that. So again, there's zoning on there. The county has, wants to look at those. And yes, you're right, jurisdictions have already looked at that. They will eventually be regulating those areas. They are going through that process. They've done a lot of inventory work. That's why Ethan mentioned that for those UGB areas that are orange on his map, I don't know if you remember that we would be bringing inventories in from others and including those in. So you're right. It could be a very short-term issue because they're going to be annexed, and in large part, I would think.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Yeah. I think it was Amanda and then Fran.
Well, so I just wanted to make a point that you have the directive that an ESE would be needed for both significant riparian areas and upland habitat. So there is a safe harbor protection measure available for riparian areas, and even if a standard inventory is used rather than the Goal 5 inventory, or if the Title 13 inventory is used, that doesn't matter. Once you've got your inventory of significant resources, you can apply the safe harbor protection measures to riparian areas without doing an ESE analysis.
Right, but in our case, for areas that are inside the metro boundary, we need to comply with Title 13 for these resources. And so the safe harbor is, my understanding is that we follow Title 13. And that would be what you're saying is absolutely true for any local significant resource. But I think for any regional resource, we need to demonstrate compliance with Title 13. So if the safe harbor would do that, then that would be what we would do. But I think we don't have the option to follow safe harbor for, say, a metro significant wildlife habitat area in a new urban area. Title 13 tells us what the program elements need to do.
I agree with wildlife habitat because there is no safe harbor protection under Goal 5, but I still, maybe I just don't understand, or I need to go back and read Title 13, but in this yellow box, demonstrate compliance with Title 13 plus prepare supplemental ESE to evaluate whether level of protection should exceed Title 13. And so if you're exceeding Title 13, my understanding is you're outside of Title 13 now, you're applying Goal 5. So we should consider again whether safe harbor could be used for riparian protection.
Right.
But maybe the safe harbor would never be an exceedance of what Title 13 requires in riparian areas.
That's what I was thinking too. I mean, I think that the problem where we would loop back around on ourselves is that I think if we're complying with Title 13 as at the minimum, and that may be the ultimate, outcome. Again, this is just saying these are the processes, the conversations that we're going to have. We don't know. We're not presuming on the outcome of those balancing decisions that the jurisdiction's going to make, right? We're just saying we're going to go through that conversation. We're going to have that conversation as an ESE. And so I think the reason to do that for these new UGB areas is to really just look at, do you want to be more protective than Title 13? And I don't think safe harbor would deliver that. And we can't be less protective because then we would not be substantially compliant. So I think that's where, we could look at it. I mean, I don't think there's no restriction on looking at it, but I think you'd have to say, is safe harbor going to be more protective than Title 13? If not, then it wouldn't be substantially compliant probably. So Glenn, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that at all. And then Fran, we'll get to your question right away.
I think I agree with what you say. I would guess, not wanting to jump too far ahead and assuming that we're necessarily going to regulate these new UGB areas any differently, but we'll wait to find out what the results of any easy analysis is of those areas. If it turns out that the county, based on the results of that easy analysis, wants to be more restrictive than what Title 13 would otherwise require, I would be curious too whether or not that safe harbor approach would be any more restrictive anyway. So I'm curious about the idea that Amanda raises, but I'm not sure it would necessarily even play out.
Right. And I think what certainly, Amanda, it's a really good point, and doesn't hurt to look at it and see what that would look like. Fran, you've got your hand up, and then I should keep us moving because I'm going to run out of time.
Yeah. Mine might be a segue into the next section, but these are a lot of really good words, but it's like hard to get my head wrapped around the verbiage. If I looked at figure 2, sheet 141, and if I remember Ethan talking about people's backyards, which are adjacent to what has been mapped as SNR or significant areas. One of the things I'm concerned about, and just maybe I'm planting a seed here, is with the pressures of affordable housing and middle housing and ADUs coming into people's areas, those buffer areas become under pressure in terms of what we can or can't do in terms of protecting those areas or giving incentives, et cetera. So when I look at the supplemental ESEE, maybe we'll be thinking about that as another concern, because we need those buffers. Even the backyard habitats are key to those situations. So that was just my take on this particular slide. It would be great if there are some examples here.
Right. I know this is like very conceptual because we're talking about the methodology, and we'll get into the next meeting. We'll be getting into certainly some more concrete examples. Matt,
I love having a structure. It's great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Matt, quick question, and then I should keep moving, or like I said, I'll run out of time.
So are there any of the new UGB areas that aren't going to be governed by a city?
Great question. I don't know. You mean like a North Bethany, for example?
Yeah, I think North Bethany was the last expansion area that isn't going to be managed by a city. And so I guess why would the county want to be more restrictive in an area that it ultimately isn't going to be the governance for?
Again, this is a question of the balancing all we're saying is, we're not saying we're going to be more restrictive. We're just saying we're going to look at what balancing the conflicting uses are.
Do you need help?
Oh, okay. Sorry. I don't think so. So I think what we want to say is, hey, we want to have a conversation about that balancing. And it's during the holding zone period, right? So it's during the time when we don't have urban zoning in place. And so what does that look like during that time? Once the jurisdiction's ready to annex and they put urban zoning on, then that's changing the dynamic. And so the conflicting uses allowed by the holding zones, while the county is the regulating authority for those areas, that's the conversation that we wanted to have. And we internally have had lots of debates. Is it necessary to do an ESE? And it's like, well, it's not 100% necessary, but if we even want to have that conversation, we should do it so that we can have a structure to balance those things.
I guess my question is, would us adopting a level of restriction that exceeded what Safe Harbor might provide for in any way handcuff the future city that is going to govern the area?
I don't believe so. Because the zoning would change, and that they would be going from a county holding zone to city urban zoning. So the conflicting uses and the ESEE analysis, the trade-offs change, right? Mm-hmm. So that the economic benefits of providing housing in the urban area are going to be a very different trade-off from what you get in, say, a holding zone type situation, right? So, and the cities are doing their own analyses for those areas and developing their own overlays so that they're ready on annexation. So I don't think there's any I don't think that's going to be a problem, to be honest. It's a really interesting question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to just, sorry, we are pressed for time. So I'm going to just go to so for those areas that we're either going to be doing a supplemental ESCE or a full, I'm going to call it a full ESCE, you know, it's the standard process, right? So we're identifying conflicting uses, determining the impact area. We're doing the actual ESCE analysis. That's the economic, social, environmental, energy consequences of allowing, limiting, or prohibiting conflicting uses. And then the end result of that is like code concepts. It's like, what might you do to reach a certain conclusion? And again, Metro's done that in certain places and reached a certain conclusion. If we want to reach a different conclusion, in some cases, that's revisiting that ESCE. So the conflicting uses, and that'll take the next slide. So a conflicting use, right? It's simply a land use that has a reasonable and customarily likely to impact a significant Goal 5 resource. It doesn't have to look at every single thing that could possibly on the planet occur. It just, you know, if something's unlikely, you don't have to take it into account. But we want to be thinking about things that are likely to occur. And so and I'm just going to move through these very quickly. We can go over this in more detail if you have questions. So the way we were thinking about conflicting uses, and again, we can look at them as groups of uses. You don't have to look at, you know, every land disturbing activities from residential versus land disturbing activities from commercial versus, you know, industrial. Like, you can kind of group them. And so that's what we've done. And that's what most ESCEs do that I'm familiar with, and including the Tualatin Basin ESCE, which we're kind of building off of. And so the categories that we're contemplating are high intensity urban, other urban, and then a kind of combined non/future urban. And then 3 kind of specialty, I'm going to call them specialty categories because they kind of have unique attributes and they occur in various zones. And that would be open space and parks and utilities and transportation facilities. And the reason to kind of, we want to keep it simple. We don't want to be, you know, parsing this too many ways because it just makes well, as we'll talk about, it just makes the ability to analyze it and get meaningful results gets more and more difficult. But you also want to kind of track on some of the categories that you think are going to need, shall we say, special attention. So these are the categories that we're looking at. They're, again, building off of what was in the Tualatin Basin ESCE, but with some variation. And does anybody have any concerns? Amanda, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So just wondering, you talked before about supplemental ESCE, and then for simplicity, I thought you moved to calling it just an ESCE. But so, I mean, if the Title 13 measures were in effect, then you wouldn't have to count any use that's not allowed under the Title 13 protected measures because they're already not allowed in the area. In this case, I mean, I would think you could still do the same thing because the county is obliged to use the Title 13 protection measures. So I guess I'm just wondering and kind of thinking that it would be possible to only look at conflicting uses that would not be allowed under allowed under Title 13.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Amanda. And I think, and again, we're talking about new urban areas, I think is what you're probably thinking about, where that would really come into play for like the wildlife habitat. And yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. Let me give that some thought. Because we have not, you know, I've been thinking about those areas. They're going to have that new/future urban or NFU, right? That's where those zones are going to occur, and those conflicting uses in that conflicting use category are the ones that we're going to be thinking about for those areas primarily. That's a really interesting point. Fran, you had a hand up?
Real quickly, I'm assuming that the schools come under the institutional facilities or public facilities. Our greatest loss of natural habitat has been to schools in Washington County. And I'm trying to understand if there's a criteria for high intensity, low intensity in there. So just something to put into the notes.
Yep, definitely. This is a very, very, just for the sake of the PowerPoint, this is a pretty condensed thing. But yeah, there's public facilities that are high intensity, and then there's public facilities that are low intensity, primarily related to, like, do they have employees on site, or, what's the kind of, so there are some criteria that are in the that were in the Tualatin Basin ESE analysis that we'll be just kind of following those similar categories. But I think schools are probably in the high intensity category, and I'd have to go back and double check that. But we'd like to be consistent to the extent that we can with what was done, with the work that was done previously, if that makes sense. Okay, moving on to talking about disturbance activities. And again, these disturbance activities, if you can picture those conflicting use categories, and if you can, and I didn't include this table in this presentation because it's so confusing, but there is a step where we take all of these kind of, in this case, they're wildlife habitat disturbing activities, and we say, okay, these disturbance activities are kind of associated with urban development, and they occur at different levels and in different frequencies in the various use categories, and we matrix that out. And so certain disturbance activities might be very strongly associated with industrial development or high intensity urban, but maybe are less likely to occur with other urban, which is more residential. But other disturbance activities, maybe it's pets and other kinds of things, have more frequency with other urban and less with high intensity, right? So we kind of we take this step of thinking about what are all the disturbance activities, right? Like, what's the universe of things that urban development does, and get that list. And then there's this step of sort of matrixing that with those categories to try and understand how these disturbances relate to those categories, so that we can really talk to the community about that. Like, well, okay, we know that urban development disturbs habitat, right? And we know that these are conflicting uses, meaning they have some or all of those disturbance activities. And what does that look like? So that's part of our, communicating about what this all means and how do you balance it. Amanda, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I get wrapped around the axle on a piece of this, which is, let's take domestic pets, or let's say dogs, right? Because the planning department, when they're issuing a development permit, has no control over how many dogs somebody has. So when I look at an ESE analysis and they talk about something like that, I just wonder whether that's right. I mean, maybe if you knew each residential dwelling had 0.6 dogs in it, and you could figure that out. But I don't know, I'm just going to raise that because I get I'm not sure like how to deal with impacts that are not actually something you can control at the planning desk.
I totally understand. This is the way I think about these disturbance activities. It's just a way to express, why are conflicting uses? What is it that's conflicting about them, right? So we have these conflicting use categories: high intensity urban, other, right? They're general categories. They do things, and we know things about them. And what we're just trying to help in the public conversation in the ESE process is, what about them is conflicting with wildlife? Like, what about that urban development category is the problem? Like, and that's all you're doing, right? It's like, okay, we know that there's activities and that are going to be a challenge for wildlife. I mean, the biggies are obviously vegetative removal and native, like removing soils and plants, right? I mean, that's like 99% of the problem, maybe not 99%, but a huge percent. But there's other things. And I think that's where we have that conversation. And I think it ends up mattering a little bit because things like, if you talk about, like, say, conflicting use category like transportation or roads, And you say, well, that's going to have a higher likelihood of direct kill of wildlife. Like that's got like, it's creating these like opportunities to actually, you know, it's roadkill, right? So crossings, like can we look at in the ESE, well, we need connectivity, and connectivity has a positive energy benefit, but it's got, if we can control those crossing points, can we mitigate some of the impact on that particular category? So it's just a way to talk about the, how those activities relate to the uses. But I'm with you. I mean, not all of them are land use issues. And that's, I think it's really just to try and help people understand. Yeah, don't mean to dwell on it so long. Okay, next slide. Okay. All right, so we have impact areas. We have inner impact and outer. These are based on the Tualatin Basin ESCE, and we're proposing to keep them. We think they worked last time for the analysis, and are helpful to think about, especially the outer impact area lets us think about things like effective impervious area regulations that are in effect in the basin, talk about those kinds of things. And so again, this is just a analysis tool to help us think about those things, to have that conversation. It doesn't say that all those areas are going to be regulated in any way. It's just saying we're using this as a tool to think about it and talk about it. Next slide. And I'm going to keep moving because I don't want to be late for our public participation. So we have ESC consequences. We have to look at the ALP, right? The allow, limit, prohibit conflicting uses. Next slide. So I think this one helps. These get really complicated. ESC, I don't know if anybody's spent any time reading ESCEs. They can be so confusing. So you've got, in our 3 scenarios, allow, limit, prohibit it. You multiply that by 4 types of consequences, the E, S, E, E. In our case, we've got 6 conflicting use categories. And you've got different outcomes for each of those intersections, right? Of it's a positive, maybe it's a neutral, maybe it's a negative outcome. So bottom line, it really helps to have a systematic approach. Next slide. So probably saw this in great detail in the memo. You probably scratched your head and said, what is all of this all about? Really just to outline for you kind of a systematic approach that we've used in the past, but it's a series of tables where for each of the 3 scenarios, allowing, limiting, or prohibiting conflicting uses, you end up with 5 tables. One looks at the economic consequences of a conflicting use, of allowing or limiting or prohibiting a conflicting use. So again, economic consequences of allowing prohibited uses. There's positive consequences and negative consequences. And so you look at each and you think about the net result of that. Similarly for social, for environmental, for energy. At the end of the day, you get a summary. What is the result of that? Then you take the summary results from the 3 scenarios and you try and use that to then balance where are the economic consequences strong or low. And you can use that as a tool to sort of understand in a big picture sense what the general result is. And then you can also use it to those numbers to help you understand areas that might benefit from a specific solution. If we can solve it this, we can make this, we can get a higher value. And a high value means it's a positive, you want a positive outcome for the jurisdiction. So with that, next slide. Okay, again, it's 2:45 and I want to make sure we stop in time to allow, we have 10 minutes for if there are questions from the public. So with the text okay, I'd like to break from our conversation for a minute and see if there are questions and make sure that we give people the allotted amount of time and then come back to my questions. if we have time to do that. And if we don't, I would really love anybody that has thoughts on these to just email those thoughts to Michelle, and then she'll forward those to me. But there's the questions for the TAC, and I want to make sure we hear from the community if there's questions out there. So, all right. Michelle, I think, how does this work? We've got somebody raising their hand, and I think then we elevate them to a speaker. Is that right? And Virginia Bruce has their hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead,
okay,
Virginia.
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Hi. I have a couple of questions. How does this play into the county's overall approach to climate change and climate protection, and how? And the other question is there anything that can be done to prevent the degradation of these areas in the interim while this process is grinding along? In other words, to keep landowners from cutting down all the trees and so forth, since the county has no tree code.
So I can answer the first part of that question, which is how would something like climate change be considered? So again, I think what we're going to be asking the community to do is think about the ESCE. So that is a positive economic, so if you think about the climate benefits as maybe an economic or environmental or social, I mean, all of those aspects, if you're looking at the preservation of trees and you say, well, we need to recognize the positive ESCE benefits of protecting, right, these resources. So that's where you're providing feedback to say we need to strengthen, we need to provide and emphasize that more. And again, the ESCE is a process to have that conversation. It doesn't specify an outcome, but it's a chance for the community members like yourself to weigh in and say what are those values, and then that balancing is how then ultimately leads to a program decision. But yes, this is that kind of process where you get to say we need more emphasis on this. It should be higher scoring. And then I think to Teresa, you might want to answer that second part of that question about what can be done now or is being done now.
Well, yeah, this isn't really set up to be a question and answer. It was more to be public comments. So, but I think quickly, part of what we're going to be looking at is what we do in the interim before cities annex areas. But between now and when we adopt the regulations, really it's just the regulations we have in place right now that we can apply. So there isn't a new interim thing that we can do between now and when we adopt new regulations. And I think that's what you're asking, Virginia. But once we adopt some interim, or once we adopt some regulations, that will apply to areas, new UGB areas before they annex to cities, which is often an issue. I know in South Cooper Mountain, that's been an issue. So we're doing this as quickly as we can to get some regulations in place.
And
but
I would also add that there's an enforcement order and new developments not allowed during the time that we're developing these regulations for wildlife habitat or sites that contain wildlife habitat.
But a landowner can cut down all his trees prior to or absent any kind of development application. That's what I'm concerned about. But yeah,
that's been the way that our programs work.
I hope I'm not giving anyone ideas.
Well, thank you for your comment, Virginia.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you.
Are there other comments from the public? Oh, Fran, you've got your hand up.
Greg and then Lee.
I just want
let's put that
clarification real quickly. Michelle, it was mentioned that there is a restraining order, or John, whatever you want to call it right now. It's only on residential development. Other development is not restricted by the current hearing. So the order. So just wanted to clarify.
Thank you. And I didn't catch, I see Greg has a hand up, and is there another?
Greg is,
Lee?
Greg first.
Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. King City is proposing putting through a road through the Columbia Land Trust Conservancy, which is a Class 1 riparian area, and it's 400 feet from the Tualatin River. Just wanted to get your comments on that. It's a huge wildlife corridor, and I would like to know if that has been part of your inventory for Goal 5.
And that's
I guess I can.
Yeah, I guess is it a question of, is it on the inventory while it's in the county still?
Yeah, I would like to get your comment about that, please.
Yeah, so again, we started with the county mapping and Metro's habitat mapping. So if that area was contained within that mapping, then it should be included. Yeah.
Can you tell me for sure if it has been included?
Greg,
I would.
you might look at the maps that are part of the TAC packet that are on our website, and you'd be able to look there and see if the ones that you're thinking about are. Oh, actually, sorry, this is a new UGB area.
Right.
So this would be if the city had mapped them.
Well, this is, and this is an area I think we need to check in with King City, because we did not get clear direction on this one, compared to like Witch Hazel and the city of Hillsborough, new UGB areas, and Cooper Mountain. So we kind of, for the King City area, we did apply our map refinements, but we probably should check in again with King City. I don't think we got a declarative response from them previously, so we should probably circle back to that.
Okay, because I would be more than happy to go ahead and lead a tour of any of you that would be interested in seeing the 12.82 acres. If you're interested, I'd be happy to go ahead and set that up. Do I have takers?
Well,
I don't know that this is probably the right moment to do that. And maybe if you wanted to send an invitation to the members of the TAC, and then they could individually decide, I think that would be, I'm assuming that's your target for that invitation. And so, yeah, I think probably not right now, as people don't know what that entails. But perhaps there's a way forward to get that invitation out there. And so let's see. And was there another hand? I think there was.
Would you be my contact person, Catherine?
No, it would be Michelle.
Michelle. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. And we'll go to Lee.
And Fran, we'll loop back to you. We want to make sure we hear from the public.
I'm trying to unmute. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to second Virginia's concerns. I know I've spoken to a couple of you at CPO meetings about these regulations, and it's been years and years talking. And meanwhile, while the talking and planning is happening, we're losing more and more. Well, that's already developed, so we cannot do anything about it. Or, the planners have already taken care of it, or the developers already purchased it. And in the last 5 years, so much has already been lost because very little action has been taken. Is there a timeline when actual regulations might be implemented?
Well, we hope to have the regulations adopted no later than early October 2024.
Yeah.
So should I write that down somewhere? As I said, this has been years of talking from, mostly I hear people talking at the CPO meetings, but it's just, so much has been taken away already and is lost and will never come back again. I mean, once you pave it, oh, there's no point. We'll color that area. We'll take that out of the green area now, of course, because as Ethan was saying, that they take their existing data from the old maps, they subtract developed areas because clearly once it's paved, you're not going to go back and unpave it and tear down housing. And you're now remapping. Well, how many times are we going to do that where we have to again subtract developed areas because of all the delays that are happening?
Okay, thank you for your comment, Lee. Much appreciated. Are there other public comments? And then if not, Fran, and then we could we have one last slide, which is just going to close out, but we could also maybe loop back to that those questions for the TAC, if you guys wouldn't mind. Okay.
I just have one real quick clarification for the TAC. So I would say that the King City, Brankston Preserve, which Greg was alluding to, the Cooper Mountain under Beaverton, and North Bethany are probably 3 good acid tests. They're all currently unincorporated Washington County, but being planned, at least King City and Beaverton are being planned out by those cities, but they're currently under unincorporated Washington County jurisdiction.
Thank you, Fran. I see Lee still has their hand up. Is that just another question? Okay, thanks, Lee. All right, just checking. Okay, Randy, can you take us back to the questions for the TAC on, I think it's slide 39? Great. So, and this is really actually very pertinent to some of the comments, which are, what about climate and what about other things? And so identifying like the positive economic and energy consequences, especially with things like upland wildlife habitat, can be challenging in an ESE. We want to recognize that there is, there are ecosystem services, right, that are provided. We have in the past used like the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, and there's more of a reference to that, more of an explanation of what that is and how we've used it in your memo. So I won't go into detail on that, but we're interested if any TAC members or members of the public, of course, have thoughts about other really useful resources that are things that we can cite to say, okay, well, here's where, that we can talk about that quantify maybe the kind of positive economic and energy consequences, because those are different. Those have been a little bit more challenging. It's easier to do the other side, right? It's a little bit more obvious to do the positive economic consequences of development, because those are just a little bit better understood by most people. So if anybody has suggestions, I would appreciate it. And then obviously that was a whirlwind tour of our approach, and there were lots of really good comments and suggestions on that, including maybe taking a closer look at safe harbor for riparian areas, and if there's a path forward using that. So we'll do that. Are there any particular thoughts on wildlife habitat? And again, because I think we have a pretty clear understanding on riparian areas of some of these factors. It's a little harder on wildlife habitat. So if anybody has thoughts about that or has any recommendations for our approach, I know we're running out of time, but I would love to hear those. If you can share them via email, that would be wonderful. And then this is ESEs can be incredibly challenging and a lot of paper, and like again, we're trying to keep it systematic, distill it down for the public, but really interested if anybody's seen a particularly good public engagement tool around the ESE process, where people are invited to kind of understand what the trade-offs are and really weigh in. Always interested and would love your suggestions. So, because it is an opportunity to help people participate in the balancing that leads to policies that lead to regulations. And with that, I think we have, Brenda, you can take us to the last slide, I think, which is simply, where are we? Public comment. Yep. And or next steps, I think is the slide. Right. So again, your comments would be really helpful. We've got upcoming property owner notifications, community forum, online open house, heading into those. We're aiming for a TAC meeting in October. At that TAC meeting, we hope to be sharing a lot of what we've heard from the community about these trade-offs, about the balancing, to have the ESCE, report and potentially code concepts to be talking about, like, what did we learn out of all of that exercise. So Teresa, Michelle, anything, Ethan, anything to share on that?
One thing, we did have the meeting notes posted from the first meeting, and that was in the packet too. So if there was anything in there that you thought was incorrect or you thought needed to be clarified, let Michelle know on that. And we'll do meeting notes for this meeting so that, and we'll put those up on the website so that people have a record of that as well.
It looks like there's a hand up. Deborah Lockwood.
Thank you. Will the slides for today's presentation be available?
Yeah, I believe we put those up pretty quickly after the meeting. Michelle, did those get onto the website, right?
Yes, those will be on our TAC web page, and the PowerPoint will be there. And then after this meeting, copy of the recording will be on YouTube too, with a link in our TAC page, so you can slow down or speed up through certain parts. Again, if you,
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions or anything for the good of the order? I think we're, by tracking all right, we're just a few minutes over time. Okay, well, thank you all for your patience. I know some of this is a little, some of the ESE steps are a little hard to track on, so I appreciate all of you paying attention and asking great questions. So thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Take care.